school, way back in 2006. I went to work for a legal aid organization in Ohio. And I remember this was during the subprime mortgage, the height of the subprime mortgage lending. And I remember I was defending people against evictions, and there was another part of our office where people were representing individuals being foreclosed on because of these subprime mortgages. And I remember talking to my colleagues, and they were talking about, look at this mortgage. There's this mortgage lender that has, given this individual who makes, $25,000 a year, this mortgage for this house. And there, if you look, on page 15 of this document, there's this balloon payment of $50,000 in the third year of this mortgage. And, this person's never going to be able to pay this. And, the balloon payment came due, and now this person is being foreclosed on. And I didn't understand at that time, and I think a lot of people didn't understand, why would a lender, give a mortgage to someone that they knew that, would never be able to be repaid by that person. And we found out the reason was because, these mortgages were being chopped up and securitized. And Wall Street had invented ways to make money off these mortgages, even though, the mortgages would never be repaid. And, obviously that resulted in the 2008 financial crisis. And we saw from that 2008 financial crisis, a transfer of wealth, a huge transfer of wealth from the 99% to the 1%, because all those people who were foreclosed on, the banks in large part ended up owning their homes. The same banks that caused the financial crisis in the first place ended up absorbing a lot of the homes of people that were foreclosed on. So after 2008, it seems like we should have learned that the marriage between housing policy and Wall Street gambling is not a marriage that is sustainable. However, I do not think we've learned that lesson. And I think the way a lot of this luxury real estate is being financed has a lot in common with 2008 and the securitization of the subprime mortgages that were being lent out. So let me sort of explain what I mean by that. The financialization of housing in the last decade has been has ballooned. So right now, the global value of real estate is $326.5 trillion. That is the value of all the real estate globally. And that is 4 times that of global GDP. So real estate is extremely, extremely valuable, the most valuable thing that exists. And every year, hundreds of billions of dollars are being invested in the global real estate market. And the people that are doing that investing are large scale, multinational, global institutional investors. So these are banks, Wall Street banks, hedge funds, venture capital funds, sovereign wealth funds. These are the people that have investment stakes in what is being developed in Washington, D.C. So you see a huge disconnect between the money coming in, where it's coming in from, and what housing is being built. There's no rational relationship between the housing that's being developed and the need on the ground. And that's why we see this giant affordable housing crisis and this huge spike in rents. But what I think is, let me backtrack a little bit. These global investors, the investment, their only thing that they are really interested in is the maximization of their profit. So they do not care about the affordable housing crisis in Washington, D.C. They don't care about social inequity. They don't care about segregation. They are investing in projects in order to make the most profit that they can possibly make. And that looks different in different places. Like I said, in Washington, D.C., that means an investment in luxury real estate. In Ohio, where I'm from originally, hedge funds are buying up entire neighborhoods. They're driving up the price of land so that people can't afford to buy homes. And they are gobbling up, all the homes in neighborhoods, and they're treating all these homes as sort of giant apartment complexes. And they're just making steady returns by making people forever renters in those places. But like I said, in DC, it looks a little different. In DC, the investment is in luxury housing. And because the investment is in luxury housing, it is driving up the cost of land. It is creating the ability for a magnitude of political corruption that's sort of off the charts. And it's, causing these rents to skyrocket. Let's sort of, to illustrate sort of how it works, and I'll get off this and move into just the nuts and bolts of social housing in a second, but I just want to sort of think about how this works and use the wharf as an example for how our housing policy works right now. So the wharf started with DC giving a developer $280 million worth of public land for $1. That developer then parlayed that public land giveaway into an $847 million loan from Goldman Sachs. So that's the institutional investor in the wharf, Goldman Sachs. The land value, once that investment was made public, that there was an $847 million investment in Southwest DC, it drove up land values all across Southwest DC. So that made it so the only people that could buy up additional land in Southwest DC were large developers who were then courting more international money to build more luxury developments. Because in order for a developer in the Southwest waterfront at this time to get financing, they have to put forward a project that is attractive to these international, to these investors. And the projects that are attractive to them are luxury housing projects. That's what they want to invest in because they want to maximize their profit. So we see public land giveaway, a big institutional investor investment driving up land prices all over the wharf. And what we get, the end product, is the wharf, which contains no affordable housing. They talk about the inclusionary zoning being affordable. I don't consider inclusionary zoning affordable housing. So the wharf contains no affordable housing, and it has a penthouse, one of their penthouse selling for $12 million. And in order to make way for that, what we saw at the wharf, in order to make way for that sort of redevelopment, years earlier, there was a revitalization that cleared out the public housing, from the wharf. And now the government wants to clear out additional public housing in Southwest to make way for more of this luxury redevelopment. And if you talk to developers about this, they'll throw up their hands and they'll say, we can't develop affordable housing because, again, we're in Washington, D.C. And when we try to get investment dollars, when we try to finance our projects, the only thing that these investors will finance is luxury development. So you see how the private market and the financialization of housing makes it very difficult to build affordable housing. It makes it very difficult. And you also see why it's sort of, absurd to think that if we just keep on giving public dollars to these developers, that they will somehow be able to build affordable housing, or that the housing will trickle down, because it won't trickle down. It's a financing issue. So what I believe is that in order to solve the affordable housing crisis, we have to take housing out of these global markets. And we have to treat housing as a public good and not a commodity. And I believe that social housing is the process by which to do that because it operates extremely economically efficiently. And it operates like a lot of housing models that we already have. Here in DC, it operates essentially like a limited equity co-op. So the way that social housing operates is, there's different types of social housing. And the model that I like to think about, government would look at housing as infrastructure. Government would build housing on public land. Government could convert existing housing that's being sold through the DOPA process, the District Opportunity to Purchase Act. Government could take control of tax delinquent properties and make that social housing. And the way social housing operates is that there is no profit motive. There is no private developer associated with the building. Because there is no private developer, there's no profit motive. And because there's no profit motive, that means rents are able to be used 100% productively. So every dollar that a tenant pays in rent is reinvested back into that building. At the end of the month, all that rent money adds up to cover the operating cost of the building. So the operating costs of the building are covered, and in a well-run social housing building, not only would the operating costs be covered, there would be a surplus past the operating costs being covered. That surplus would have been before the developer profit. But instead of being a developer profit, that surplus turns into money that can be used to pay off the, price of building the building. And once a social housing system really gets rolling, that surplus becomes a money that can go back to the government. So the government could take those surpluses from all these social housing buildings and use that to reinvest in more affordable housing. They could use that to reinvest in public schools. They could use that to reinvest in job training programs. The idea of social housing is to not let a private developer get all the spoils of housing, but instead to allow the government to build housing and have those buildings operate as an asset for the government to provide deeply affordable housing for people, but also to fund the creation of more housing. So social housing is the government building mixed income communities that end up paying for themselves. And those buildings ultimately become assets for the government. I think that is a much more efficient housing model than the model that I described earlier with the wharf. And again, the idea that we can solve this problem within the global markets is, I think it's a fool's errand. I've been involved in housing advocacy in Washington, D.C. for a very long time. And I think that we really have to start thinking outside the box if we want to actually solve the affordable housing crisis. We look at things, let me not get into that right now. Let me talk about more aspects of social housing. So not only would social housing provide these mixed income communities, deeply affordable rents for tenants, but social housing would also provide deeply affordable rents for small businesses. So we know that in Washington, D.C., small businesses are being priced out just like tenants are being priced out of the district. So think of, in a social housing model, the ground floor retail of social housing would be able to provide space for those small businesses that exist in Washington, D.C., for small businesses that the district could help fund with seed money. And those small businesses would be paying a fraction of the rent that they would pay at the ground floor of these, commercial real estate luxury buildings. But that fraction of that rent would also go a long way to cover the operating costs of the building and eventually pay off the building. So we're creating affordable rents for tenants. We're creating affordable rents for small businesses. And lastly, I think of a social housing project in the District of Columbia as being able to provide a jobs program for district residents, a massive jobs program, and it would allow the greening of our housing infrastructure in the District of Columbia. I am working for the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless. I had represented a lot of tenants associations that were just, abhorrent, tenants living in abhorrent housing conditions. And this would be an opportunity for the district. I represented some buildings above the Congress Heights Metro that got, a lot of press. The Attorney General's office ended up coming in and partnering with us and the tenants in order to put the property into receivership. So imagine if the District of Columbia would take control of properties right now, a lot of properties east of the river that are in a poor condition, and put them into receiverships, force sales back to the district, and those properties could be rehabbed and turned into social housing. And the lead pipes in those properties could be replaced. As part of, our public housing stock right now, we have a bunch of lead pipes, we have bad housing conditions. This could be a way in which to rebuild and green our housing infrastructure. The thing I will say, in order to make social housing work, you have to have a mix of incomes in these buildings. So social housing is unlike traditional public housing, and that traditional public housing, it had a lot of low income people living together. And the problem with that is that the rents of low income people together cannot cover the operating costs of the building. So that is why, the federal government stopped funding public housing, and public housing started to crumble around the residents that live there because these rents couldn't cover the operating costs. So part of a social housing model is, not only decommodification, but having mixed income communities so that the operating costs are covered. And, I think it's a way to sort of naturally desegregate our housing policy. I did during the campaign, I did a webinar with an architect from Vienna who was involved in their social housing department. And she spoke about being a single mother going to school, and on her floor in her building was a retired person on a pension, a doctor, and a cab driver, and herself, a single mother going to university. And she talked about that being such a healthy mix, to have in her building, and just providing sort of a much healthier environment within which to raise her kid, having that mix of incomes, having the diversity of social and economic strata coming together really created a beautiful building for her. So part of social housing is a way to desegregate, to mix incomes in communities. If you study Vienna, one of the things people talk about at Vienna is that all parts of Vienna are sort of connected, and it's easy to get around in Vienna. And a lot of people attribute that to housing policy, because unlike Washington, D.C., there's no parts of it that are just completely abandoned. Like I live in Deanwood, in D.C., and Deanwood, receives, no investment until, it becomes a opportunity zone. And then The fear is that the type of investment that will occur in Deanwood will be a rush of capital into Deanwood, and that rush of capital will build housing that, just like the Southwest waterfront, that rush of capital in will increase land values and will push existing residents out of Deanwood, because Deanwood's, ripe now for redevelopment. It has been abandoned, it has been undercapitalized. And, so now it's, in Washington, D.C., and the land is, cheap comparatively to other parts of Washington, D.C. And what we don't want to happen is this manifest destiny approach to development, where you get just a rush of capital in, you get a very small period of time where there is desegregation because white people move in, but pretty soon it just becomes high majority white people, moving in. And the existing residents are pushed out. So what social housing does is it provides a way in which to inject capital into communities, by injecting government resources, government money into communities, having the ability for renters to move into buildings, new buildings, with those renters having more income. And that injection of capital into the community allows businesses to come into the community, like grocery stores, like sit-down restaurants, but it doesn't come at the expense of the existing residents. Again, it's a much more equitable way to develop. So, like I said, I think that social housing is a way, and the other thing about the ability to finance these projects is right now we layer financing in a lot of affordable housing projects. So think of the ability to layer financing in a social housing model. You could have extremely low income people living in social housing buildings by utilizing what we have already, vouchers, both federal and local vouchers. So right now, those federal and local vouchers, if they're being used in the private market, every new voucher you get, last budget season, there was a bunch of new vouchers that came online, which is great because people need them. However, when those vouchers come online, they increase cost across the board. So an influx of vouchers into the private market will increase rents, just like healthcare subsidies, increased healthcare costs. When we subsidize private healthcare companies in order to provide healthcare for more people, healthcare costs jump. The same thing happens with vouchers. So imagine if we had a model where we were building social housing and then using those vouchers not to, go into the private market and stoke rents, but instead having those vouchers be able to finance public or social housing projects. So extremely low income people would still have the ability to live in these units, and that government money could be used to cover the operating cost and create surpluses to go back to the government. Again, it's just a more efficient model of using these subsidies and using this housing. I still represent the tenant association in Brooklyn Manor, and part of part of that is we're fighting tooth and nail for voucher holders to be able to remain a part of that community once the redevelopment occurs. But none of the tenants are under any illusions that in order to do that, that would stoke up the cost of housing everywhere around Brooklyn Manor. So the system is how it is now. We have to work within that system and fight for these things within our current system. But again, if we really want to get underneath and solve this crisis, we have to move to a new system. Having the local government give away land, give away our tax dollars in order to subsidize private developers to build housing, thinking it will trickle down, is not going to work. And, the only people that believe that is going to work are people that sort of don't understand this global market and how it works in housing, or completely understand it and are just in on the game and are working hand in glove with developers and cynically using affordable housing as a justification to give more money, more public money to developers. And I think that's what, our mayor, or the plan that I just saw a re-election video today where she was touting the amount of money, spent on affordable housing. But that money is not being spent on affordable housing. It's just being given to private developers to build market rate housing that they say will trickle down and become affordable at some point. So we have to move away from this. We have to move away from these bad faith arguments. We have to build housing that's inclusive in all parts of the city, that is economically efficient. And I believe social housing is the way to do that. I see I've rambled a little bit, and I apologize for that. But I would like to just open it up now and, have a conversation. And I don't know if someone here wants to moderate it or if I should just call on people as I see hands.
So, Will, that was awesome. Thank you so much. And please feel free to moderate yourself. There is a question already for you in the chat. And okay. I see hands.
So I see in the chat, Nancy, I gotta say, I have a history with Nancy. Nancy was when I was just starting to work for the legal clinic and I was challenging the Congress Heights property at zoning. I had no idea what I was doing. I called Nancy and she was a huge help. So thank you for that, Nancy. So Nancy says, says, other than public housing sites where the land is public, how would the city invest in land? Contract with the developer to either rehab an existing building, add to it, or rebuild it without a return on investment? Wouldn't the city have to carry cost of a building until and unless there was a surplus from rents? How many years would it take to recoup the public investments? So that is a great question. The initial investment in social housing would be an investment like an investment in infrastructure. So it would not be something that has an immediate return. It would be like investing in roads and bridges. I would argue that right now we're spending money that we could be spending investing in affordable housing. We're just giving it to private developers like I just talked about. So I think that there's money available to use to create and build this type of housing that is already able to be accessed if we change the way we thought about housing. But to your point, yeah, I mean, we would have to absolutely, the government would have to carry costs until these buildings started paying for themselves. And that would take some time. However, just like when a co-op buys, when a bunch of tenants buy a building for a co-op and they get a loan and they start, paying off that loan, the government would just essentially be that, it would be the people that were using the surplus of rents to pay off that loan. But yeah, it would take time and it wouldn't be, it would be upfront cost associated with it for sure. The other issue with I just lost my train of thought where I was going, but yeah, it would be an upfront cost for sure. But I think, at the end of the day, it would be more efficient. So I see Kathy G has her hand up.
Hi there, Will, and again, echo what Margaret had to say. Thank you so much for being here and talking to us. But I did, want to clarify a little bit what you were talking about in the beginning when you were talking about, the global financial markets and the financialization of housing and so forth. I come from the direction of that kind of financing and spent pretty much my career in mortgage-backed securities. And the organization where I was recruited to work in 2008 was Ginnie Mae. And just for a sense of scale, this very month, Ginnie Mae was the government agency that wrapped a bunch of FHA, VA, and RHS mortgages to the tune of $69 billion this month. And of those, a very small minority are actually multifamily. But it's the tiny minority is 3.4 billion that was done this month by, and these are government guaranteed loans. And I think that what needs a little tempering there is you need, I mean, can you imagine trying to find investors at that scale? This is just Ginnie Mae, not including Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And the CFPB has gone a long way to get rid of most of those private label mortgages. That private label world largely gone. So I think that when you talk about the globalization and financialization, it needs clarification between the ones that are the money gougers and the people who are out there looking at a $12 trillion market of securities that are pretty much regulated, heavily regulated loans. And just even on the multifamily side, the idea that just one of these, the smallest of the agencies, is doing $3.5 billion a month gives you a sense of scale and what can be achieved. So I would say that looking at what can be done through the programs that either exist in those government agencies or through government guarantees or creating new ones is something that would be, an important thing to do, because you can't get that scale if you're just looking at the US and if you don't structure the securities. And I know that's not what you're talking about, where you're talking about pure luxury, but that's something of a different market, I would tend to say, and certainly not single family. And it's very different from most multifamily, and very different from what you were talking about as the people coming in and vacuuming up houses in single family houses, all very different markets.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And I'd love to talk to you more offline about just your expertise and that and understanding how this works, because I'm learning about it as I go. So I'd love to get your email and sort of talk to you more about that offline. Carol, go ahead.
Seems like, thank you, Will. It's great to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Seems like Ward 3 is sort of an ideal location in a way for social housing. But I guess my question really is, when you have a high cost for land, can you make the economics work, or does it start falling apart?
I think that, this is one of the reasons why it's such a sort of depressing aspect of how much public land we've given away over the previous couple administrations, because the most efficient way to do this obviously would be to build on public land. But there is still public land in the district that we can build on. DCHA has a huge portfolio of real estate in Washington, D.C. that they're sitting on because they're speculating on it. Just like a lot of, developers are doing, and waiting for, their ability to, as they put it, maximize the economic impact. So they're, waiting for, injection of capital into the neighborhoods in order to sell it. In Deanwood, there's a ton of DHCD property. So it is tough acquisition costs with the cost of land in Washington, D.C. to be able to buy something and build, housing that you're going to have to wait for a return on. But I do think we can use public land. I do think there's the ability to tap into, a lot of properties, the DHCD, tax delinquent properties that they have. I think that, we can tap into, like I said, the District Opportunity to Purchase Act, and especially cracking down on slumlords and being able to put their properties into receivership. I think it encouraged sales from those people to the district that would be able to, give the district housing at a premium price that could be rehabbed and created, into social housing. So I think that there's ways other than, the high cost of, buying land in areas, of Washington, D.C. that are really, really expensive right now. but I wouldn't rule that out either. The government has a lot of resources. There's a lot of things in the budget that are funded that that money could go to this type of development. And I think, if I had my way, the Housing Production Trust Fund would be used solely for the creation of social housing. And that we would start using these resources that we have at our disposal, not giving them away to the, private, but using them for the public good. So it is a challenge, but I think it's a challenge that can be overcome. I see Meg has her hand up.
Actually, I think Sandra had her hand up before I did.
Sandra.
Well, thank you very much. And I voted for you, Will, because you were the only person out there who was really talking. Oh, no, I'm not muted. Oh, okay. I thought maybe Karen was trying to tell me I was muted there. You were the only person who was talking with, half a brain about housing, other than this fig leaf of inclusionary zoning that has been used by the administration to pretend that they're actually providing genuinely affordable housing to people through that ridiculous program that really doesn't generate any really affordable housing. So I do applaud what you're trying to do. But I have two concerns. One of them is applying these European models. It sounds great, but a lot of those countries are ethnically and racially homogeneous. They are not as fraught with sort of the racial divide that we have in the United States, in most cities anyway. So that's one concern that I have. The other is that it doesn't appear that people are in social housing are getting out of being renters. They're just lifetime renters. And yes, it is affordable, but the way the tax structure works in the United States, home mortgages are a major source of tax deductions. And it's also the way people build wealth here in the United States. And so I think they're sort of the two concerns that I have with trying to graft the European model onto, say, Washington, D.C. or anywhere in the U.S.
I think those are great points. The first point that you make about Europe being racially homogeneous and ethnically homogeneous, that's absolutely true. I do think there's a lot of parts of Washington, D.C. right now, like my neighborhood that I live in now. We are sort of, there is a diversity on my block right now that's happening, and everybody's getting along very well, So I think that in DC right now, we have some neighborhoods that are, going through this mix. And yes, there are issues absolutely with that, and there are going to be issues with that. However, I don't think that anything can be worse than the way in which we are creating housing policy right now. Having just, one of the highest concentrations of segregation in the country, east of the river. And then, having these communities just have, like I said earlier, giant injections of capital, like this going on at Rhode Island Avenue right now, and pushing people out to further push them out into areas of high poverty and increasing segregation. So yes, it would be a challenge, absolutely. And there would be challenges associated with, this model in the United States, but I don't think that means it's not worth doing. The other issue that you bring up that I think is spot on is the home ownership issue, and the fact that home ownership is the way to build wealth. And I don't disagree with that. And I would say that social housing is not a means to discourage people from being homeowners. what I would argue is that a social housing model allows people to pay affordable rents, which allows them to save money, which allows them to then buy homes should they choose. And I think a lot of people would choose to buy homes. The part of, the issue with renting right now is that people can just never save. People are perpetually in debt from the high rents now. So I think that I wouldn't ever say that social housing should be a substitute for the private market in either rental housing or home ownership. I think that, in places like Vienna, there's a high rate of home ownership and there is private rental housing. So social housing, I would look more of as a public option for renters. Still with people having the ability to buy a home. I think it would be almost like a sort of a home ownership program a little bit, because again, you're allowing people to save instead of spending all their money on rent.
But does the model, let me just follow up quickly, does the model ever, this European model, ever provide for the tenants actually taking control of the building and owning it?
No, there would be no equity stake in the social housing. Like, it would be the building would operate as a government-owned asset that would eventually generate money for the government. So the government could use that money that the building generates to create pathways to home ownership, for social housing residents possibly. So I would say that there would still need to be investment from the government in, housing opportunities, the ability for people to own homes, just like the government now has a home ownership program through the district government. We would still have those programs, but we would have a real affordable rental housing program as well, and a social housing model. But no, I think, social housing, I think we would still have to fund, vouchers in order to layer financing. Like I said, I think we would still have, to fund programs to allow people to own homes if they wanted to. But I think, not to repeat myself, I think social housing gives the ability for people to save, to be able to do that more easily than they can in the current climate.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your questions.
So I'm just going to interject for 1 second. We have about 15 minutes left. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4 people with their hands up. So I'm counting on everybody to be really succinct so we can hear all the questions and hear Will's great answers for them. Thanks.
And I should probably be more succinct as well. So I apologize. I think Meg?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Will. This is really fascinating. So can you address the practicalities of setting up an agency that could do this in DC? What kind of residents are you getting on the council or with people who are planning to run with these ideas? And what are the steps to making this kind of thing a reality? Is it some demonstration project that we need to be focusing here in Ward 3 on somehow pushing through something when the government is not prepared to do it? And government has a bad rap in terms of delivering housing.
Yep. Great questions. Both Robert White and Janice Lewis George have reached out to me to talk about social housing. So I think that there is, I don't know how serious, either of, their offices really are about social housing. I had a great conversation with Janice Lewis George's staff, though, about the ability to possibly have a demonstration project in Washington, D.C. I think a great way to have a demonstration project in Washington, D.C. would be start with a, 4-unit garden style apartment and have the district take it over and operate it as social housing. And I think you could start seeing returns from rents very quickly with that sort of project, and see how the model is, extremely efficient and could generate, it could be an asset generator for the government. So yeah, there is some momentum, around the idea. The other issue you raised, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on I think it was the first part of your question. The government agency.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, I completely agree that the government does things very not well when they aren't prioritizing it. So, in order for government to operate, I think we would have to create a office, an agency for social housing within the district government. And for social housing to work and actually be, viable, the district would have to buy into it and would have to, like I said, look at it as a way to solve affordable housing, as a massive jobs program and a small business program, and prioritize social housing by hiring, extremely competent people and making sure that, people were motivated behind the idea of, actually solving this, thinking of it as, I don't want to be, too dramatic, but a revolutionary project that people would want to be a part of and that government would want to make work. Because Washington, D.C., it could be a model in Washington, D.C. with the tax base that we have, and, the resources that we have to make things work in Washington, D.C. If we prioritized it, I believe we could make it work, but government would have to buy in. Because if if it ended up being a project like, what's happened with DCHA, where administrations have treated DCHA as, their pet agency to give things away, to give valuable real estate away to developers. The administration, this administration's emphasis, has never been on trying to save or run public housing well. They've tried to privatize it and demolish it. And that shows itself in the way it's managed. It's a disgrace. So social housing couldn't be run that way. It would have to be bought into, and really, people would have to believe in it. I see Jonathan. Oh, and Karen, you're next.
Yes. Shall I speak now?
Well, go ahead, Karen. Yeah, we'll do Jonathan after Karen.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you so much for speaking with us about social housing. I'm one of the people who voted for you, and I just am very interested in social housing as a possible model here. I have two questions. The first is, I thought that at least in Austria, social housing did provide housing for people from other races, cultures, and ethnicities, for immigrants and so forth, so that it was a more multi-ethnic type situation, not just for the main citizens, and their mainstream culture. But I don't know, am I wrong on that? And my second question was, what do you think about some of the social housing developments that have included market rate developers and nonprofit developers? I'm thinking particularly of some of the properties that Jonathan Rose's company has developed, for example, in Villa Verde in the Bronx, and other locations in the US. Because those properties that are developed by market rate and nonprofit, those properties do include opportunities for home ownership.
Mm-hmm. In Vienna, yeah, I mean, the social housing's open to, everyone. I'm not sure about, the immigration implications of social housing in Austria, but like Sandra said, even having it open to everyone, there's still, the homogeneity of Europe is what it is. So it is a much more, there is not the ethnic diversity that we would have in Washington, D.C. Like I said, I think that's a challenge that could be, not only like dealt with, but embraced. And I think we should embrace that. To your point around the projects that have private developers associated with them, I'm somewhat familiar with the project in the Bronx, and I think what they are doing is fundamentally implementing a social housing model, but still having a private developer involved entails, a profit coming out of the building to that developer. So what I think about social housing is eliminating the developer so that 100% of the rents and 100% of the would-be profit can be invested back into the building, pay off the cost, and eventually having that building become an asset for the government, because I think that is how we incentivize the government to buy into social housing. But, for the time being, I think the projects like, that in the Bronx are great. I just want I want to take it one step further. And like I said, we have that model existing in Washington, D.C. right now. They're called limited equity co-ops. I mean, fundamentally in a limited equity co-op, people, can't get their equity stake out of those properties much more than what they've paid in. So I think the government should build that on scale. And instead of having, the limited equity stake, I believe that people, that should be government owned, again, to incentivize the government to build assets, to become the developer and reap the rewards that a developer would reap. Not as much reward because we wouldn't be building luxury apartments, but to get those rents so that they're incentivized to build the social housing.
I think just, I'll just say one other thing and then I'll stop talking and the next person can talk. But my impression was that by including a market rate developer, it made it much easier to attract money to make the building get built more quickly. That's all I'm.
Yeah, and I'm sure that that's true the way the system's set up now. I think that's true, probably. Jonathan, go ahead.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, I really appreciate all of this. I was watching an ANC3G meeting, and they had Suzanne Slater from Habitat for Humanity there, and an architect who does some affordable housing work, and social housing came up, and they asked the two panelists to define it. The architect passes. Suzanne Slater says, I would say that term is kind of fluid right now. It's hard to know what it means. Now, you might have already answered this because maybe that's just some of the work we have to do, just like we have to do, if you're doing housing justice work in DC, it's also racial justice work, and we have to have some hard conversations about race. Maybe it's just a hard message of getting the word out, helping people learn what public housing, what social housing is. And you mentioned that model of like having a demonstration property that's really small, but makes it really concrete. Is that kind of the way to go there? What do we do if people, even panelists, are saying, I don't even know what social housing is?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that we have to define, people talk about social housing in a lot of different ways. My concept of social housing is, like I said, government-owned buildings acting as an asset for the government so that we can keep rents as low as possible, because we don't have any other extraction of rents from any private, partners. So that's different than a limited equity co-op. That's different than, a tax credit property. That's different than any other type of, nonprofit developer building a property. Right now, I'm trying to work on a social housing white paper and a series of articles that I'm trying to get published in DC to sort of put out my concept of what that is. But people have different concepts of it. And I think what's important is that, people who are advocating for it are advocating for what their concept is. And then we can have a conversation around the different concepts. But I think, I have to define for you all what my concept is. And, then you all can look at what other people are talking about if they're talking about social housing and see which one you like's better. And it's a battle of ideas, and hopefully the best idea wins. And that's a beautiful thing. So I think moving forward, social housing, the word is going to be bandied about a little bit. I think it will mean different things to different people. I'm planning on making what I believe it is very clear and accessible for people to be able to see and understand if they choose to do so. And I don't know if I'm missing Margaret. I see your hand.
Thank you. My question was formed before some of this conversation, but Meg asked a lot of it. Given the government agencies that exist and the different silos, it's just amazing to me how housing is so split up into these different things, and nobody can, they're impregnable. You can't go from one, they can't merge, they can't connect, they can't do anything. It seems to me that the idea that you'd have to have a whole new agency, which I think is important, that means legislation. And I'm wondering if legislation is something that we should be thinking about.
Yeah, I would love for people to be thinking about legislation, and maybe that's something that we can do with, existing members of the council that are interested on this. I agree, the siloing of these things, housing from jobs, from schools, from community safety, is maddening to me. And I think that all these things connect. And what we see, I think, in Washington, D.C., that's causing a lot of the issues with community safety that we're having right now is a general disinvestment in human beings, from the disinvestment in our schools, which our public schools are some of the lowest performing. We have one of the highest rates of unemployment for Black men east of the river. And we have segregated, a very segregated district in which we live in. And I think that's why we have to think about social housing, not only housing. Let's create jobs. Let's encourage and support small businesses through the process. And let's use social housing to desegregate neighborhoods so that we have better public school systems across the board in Washington, D.C. So I think that it is, we have to talk about these things as if they're connected, because they all are so connected. And we have to stop, siloing housing, because it is absurd. When I got to DC, there were like 20. I would sit in a staff meeting and I didn't know what anybody was talking about, because there were so many acronyms for the different housing programs. And I believe that any housing system that operates like that is bound to fail, because it all is being siloed and nobody's connecting the dots.
And it's siloed within the housing concept. I mean, apart from education and job training.
Absolutely.
You can't get anywhere. Anita Bonds is so useless, but the way she, it's just, oh, well, that's topo, or that's dopo, or that's, HTTPF, whatever, so therefore it's nobody's,
Right.
I think that's a real problem in how difficult it is for us to get anywhere, even with something as straightforward and simple as Marriott.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It really is. And I think it's by design in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I talk to, over and over, you hear people, and Margaret, I know we got to get going, but over and over, you hear people in Washington, D.C. talk about politicians demagoguing on affordable housing and then getting elected and saying, man, it's so difficult. It's so complicated. It's complicated because people make it complicated. I would argue that social housing is not complicated at all. And it would get underneath the root causes of the affordable housing crisis and be a real way to solve it.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really inspirational. What a great note to end on.
Well, thank you again for having me. I greatly appreciate it. like I said, sorry for rambling. I hope that I was able to answer, anybody's questions. And I'll drop my email in the chat. So if anybody wants to reach out with additional questions or just to have, additional conversations, please feel free to do so.
Can you, at times, it looked like you were reading from something. Do you have a little script or an outline or something that you?
I just had like a little outline that I put together before we spoke. It would probably only make sense to me. I'm happy to share it, but I don't know if it'll make that much sense.
I'd love to. I mean, Sandra and I are both scrambling to take notes and
Well,
recording, but it would be helpful to have that.
I will definitely send it around. And like I said, in the next couple of weeks, there'll probably be hopefully a series of articles, and I'll let you guys know where it's published. That sort of the first part will be the sort of financialization, and then the second part will be detailing the social housing model that I'm talking about and how it can contribute to education, jobs. So a lot of what we talked about tonight, I'm in the process of writing.
Good, thank you.
Will, I can't thank you enough. This was fascinating. You've given us a lot to think about. And actually, we may reach out to you again because part of our organizing is working with council members to advance legislation for housing justice. So
great.
We might want to pick your brain some more, or even have us work together on something. So
that would be great. Would love to.
Okay. All right. And I want to thank again, also in addition to Will, the Education and Onboarding Committee that made this presentation happen, especially Alejandra, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, but who is the one who pulled Will in, since they're both working on Brooklyn Manor together. So thanks to Alejandra in absentia, thanks to Will very much right here now, and thanks to everybody for making this such a good conversation. Appreciate you all.
Bye-bye.
See you soon.
Are we done? Meg,
Yes.
Margaret? Okay, so we
So
should,
let me turn off the recording.